Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and decide to conduct an experiment that will fundamentally alter your reality. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic proclamation, simply this. You stop being instantly available to everyone who demands your attention, your energy, your emotional labor. No immediate responses to every text, no rushing to solve problems that aren't yours, no automatic yes to requests that drain your soul, just silence, strategic, intentional unavailability. What do you think would happen? Most people believe they would lose friends, damage relationships, appear selfish or cold. They fear the social exile that comes with setting boundaries. But here's what actually unfolds, and it's more unsettling than you might imagine. The moment you become unavailable, you discover who was using you and who actually valued you. The manipulators panic. The energy vampires become desperate. Those who saw you as an emotional emergency button suddenly don't know how to function without your predictable reactions. And in that chaos, in that uncomfortable silence where your voice used to be, something extraordinary emerges. Your actual power. This isn't about becoming cruel or indifferent. This is about recognizing a profound psychological truth that Carl Jung understood decades ago, that your availability has become your prison, and your unavailability might be your liberation. But why is this so difficult to grasp? Why do we resist the very thing that could free us from emotional servitude? Consider the paradox. We live in a world that demands constant connectivity, instant responses, perpetual emotional labor. We've been conditioned to believe that our worth is measured by how quickly we answer, how much we give, how available we remain to others' needs. We've been conditioned to believe that our worth is measured by how quickly we answer, how much we give, how available we remain to others' needs. We wear our exhaustion like a badge of honor, our people-pleasing like a virtue. Yet underneath this performance lies a devastating reality. We've become strangers to ourselves, reactors rather than creators of our own experience. You see, there's something profoundly disturbing about how easily we surrender our energy to those who would never reciprocate. How we've learned to mistake being needed for being valued. How we confuse our utility with our worth. We give and give and give, hoping that our perpetual availability will somehow guarantee that others will be there when we need them. But it doesn't work that way, does it? Jung understood that the human psyche operates on energy finite, precious energy that must be carefully guarded and consciously directed. Every reaction you give to unworthy stimuli, every emotional response to manipulation, every moment of availability to those who drain rather than nourish you, it's all an investment. And most of us are investing in emotional bankruptcy. But what if I told you that your unavailability could be the most powerful force for transformation in your life? What if the very thing you fear, withdrawing, becoming selective, guarding your energy, is actually the key to commanding genuine respect, attracting authentic relationships, and discovering who you truly are beneath all the masks you wear to please others? The question that haunts every conscious person eventually becomes, how long will you allow others to control you through your own reactions? How long will you remain a puppet dancing to the emotional rhythms of those who see you only as a resource to be consumed? This is where everything changes. This is where you discover that your silence can be more powerful than 1,000 arguments, that your absence can speak louder than your presence ever did, and that the moment you stop being available to everyone, you finally become available to yourself. But to understand why this transformation is so radical and why it terrifies others so profoundly, we must first examine the hidden psychological forces that have conditioned you into this state of perpetual availability. We must look at the invisible chains that bind you to other people's emotional chaos and understand why breaking free feels so impossible, so wrong, so selfish. Because until you see the prison, you cannot appreciate the freedom that awaits beyond its walls. If you felt that unsettling recognition while reading these words, if something deep inside you is stirring with both fear and excitement, then you're ready for what's coming next. This isn't just another self-help concept. This is a complete rewiring of how you understand power, relationships, and your own psychological sovereignty. But here's the thing. Most people will read this and do nothing. They'll nod along, feel momentarily inspired, then return to their pattern of emotional servitude. Don't be most people. Hit that like button if you're ready to discover why your unavailability is your greatest weapon. And subscribe to this channel because what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you move through the world. Turn on notifications because once you start seeing these patterns, you can't unsee them, and you'll want every piece of this psychological puzzle. Stay with me until the end. The final revelation will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human connection and personal power. Trust me, you don't want to miss what Jung discovered about the hidden forces controlling your life. The tragedy of your constant availability isn't that you're being kind, it's that you're being controlled, and you don't even know it. What you call generosity, Jung would call psychological imprisonment. What you believe is love, he would recognize as a desperate attempt to avoid the terrifying possibility of rejection. This compulsion to be perpetually accessible didn't emerge from nowhere. It was carefully cultivated. Beginning in your earliest years, when you learned that love was conditional, that it had to be earned, maintained, and constantly proven through service to others. Perhaps you were the child who learned that tears stopped when you made everyone else smile. Maybe you discovered that conflict ended when you absorbed the emotional chaos of adults who should have been managing their own inner worlds. Or possibly you realized that attention, any attention, only came when you were useful, helpful, indispensable. Jung understood that this pattern creates what he called the persona, a mask we wear not just for others but eventually for ourselves. The persona of the eternally available person becomes so convincing that you forget it's a performance. You begin to believe that your worth genuinely depends on your accessibility, that love is something you must constantly earn through emotional labor, that saying no makes you selfish rather than self-preserving. But here's where Jung's insights become psychologically devastating. This persona doesn't just hide your true self from others, it hides your true self from you. You become so skilled at reading everyone else's emotional needs that you lose touch with your own, so practiced at being what others require that you forget what you actually want, so committed to avoiding their discomfort that you become numb to your own pain. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer recognized this dynamic in his concept of the will to live, the driving force that compels us to survive at any cost. But survival, for the chronically available person, doesn't mean physical preservation. It means psychological acceptance. You've learned to confuse being needed with being loved, being useful with being valued, being accessible with being appreciated. This is reinforced by a society that profits from your availability. Consumer culture thrives on people who can't say no, who feel guilty for prioritizing themselves, who believe that self-care is selfish. Social media platforms are designed to keep you constantly responsive, always available, perpetually engaged. The modern world has turned human attention into a commodity, and you've been trained to give yours away for free. Jung would say you're living in a state of unconscious identification. You've become so fused with your role as the available one that you can't imagine existing any other way. The thought of disappointing someone, of being seen as cold or uncaring, of facing the possibility that people might not need you triggers such profound anxiety that you'll sacrifice your own well-being to avoid it. But the most insidious aspect of this psychological trap is how it masquerades as virtue. Society celebrates the self-sacrificing, the always available, the perpetually helpful. You receive praise for being such a good friend, for always being there, for putting others first. This positive reinforcement creates a feedback loop that makes the prison feel like a palace. Yet Jung knew that what we resist in ourselves, we attract in others. Your inability to set boundaries doesn't just drain you, it attracts boundary violators. Your fear of conflict doesn't create peace, it invites chaos. Your desperate need to be needed doesn't generate authentic love, it summons users, manipulators, and emotional vampires who can sense your availability from across a crowded room. The hidden problem isn't just that you're too available, it's that your availability has become the foundation of your identity, and anything that threatens that availability threatens your very sense of self. What you don't realize is that your constant availability has created a psychological ecosystem where everyone around you has learned to function as emotional parasites, and you've become their willing host. This isn't hyperbole. It's a precise description of what Jung called psychic vampirism, where your energy becomes the fuel for others' emotional stability, while your own inner world withers away. The most devastating consequence isn't what others take from you, it's what you lose of yourself in the process. Every time you respond instantly to a message, you train your nervous system to prioritize external demands over internal awareness. Every time you drop your own plans for someone else's crisis, you reinforce the neural pathways that tell your brain that your needs don't matter. Every time you explain yourself when you've done nothing wrong, you strengthen the psychological programming that your existence requires justification. Jung understood that psychic energy operates like a closed system. It's finite. And when it's constantly flowing outward, it creates a dangerous vacuum within. This is why chronically available people often experience what seems like inexplicable depression, anxiety, or emptiness. They're not mentally ill, they're energetically bankrupt. They've given away so much of their vital force that there's nothing left to sustain their own psychological well-being. But here's the most chilling realization. The people who benefit from your availability have unconsciously learned to create crises, drama, and emergencies, specifically to trigger your compulsive need to help. They don't do this maliciously, they do it automatically, because they've discovered that your energy is more accessible to them than their own. They've outsourced their emotional regulation to you. And now, they're addicted to the relief you provide. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness in those around you. But it also creates something far more insidious in you: learned worthlessness. You begin to believe, on a cellular level, that your value exists only in relation to others' needs. Your self-worth becomes contingent on being wanted, needed, accessed, and consumed by people who have never learned to want, need, or access themselves. The cognitive bias at work here is what behavioral economists call the sunk cost fallacy. You've invested so much energy, time, and identity into being available that the thought of stopping feels like admitting that all of that sacrifice was meaningless. So you continue pouring yourself out, not because it's working, but because stopping would force you to confront the horrifying possibility that you've been living someone else's life instead of your own. Meanwhile, your nervous system is operating in a constant state of hypervigilance, always scanning for the next person who might need you, the next crisis you might need to solve, the next emotional fire you might need to extinguish. This chronic activation of your stress response doesn't just exhaust you, it rewires your brain to seek out problems to solve, drama to resolve, and chaos to calm. You become addicted to being needed, because being needed is the only time you feel real. The cultural programming runs so deep that you've internalized the belief that self-care is selfish, that boundaries are cruel, that prioritizing your own needs makes you a bad person. Society has convinced you that your value lies in your utility, that love must be earned through service, that peace comes through pleasing everyone except yourself. But perhaps the most tragic consequence is this: you've become invisible to yourself. You know everyone else's triggers, preferences, and emotional patterns, but you can't remember the last time you sat in silence and asked yourself what you actually want. You've become an expert at reading others while becoming illiterate in the language of your own soul. This invisibility creates a terrifying feedback loop. The more you disappear from your own life, the more desperately you seek validation from others, which makes you more available, which makes you more invisible, until you exist only as a function in other people's stories rather than as the protagonist of your own. But what if I told you that your greatest act of rebellion isn't fighting back, it's simply withdrawing? What if the most radical thing you could do isn't to argue, explain, or defend yourself, but to simply become unavailable? This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes revolutionary. Individuation isn't about becoming a better version of who others want you to be, it's about becoming who you actually are, even if that person is unrecognizable to those who've grown comfortable with your performance. It's the process of separating your authentic self from the collective expectations, social conditioning, and psychological projections that have been shaping you since birth. The rebellion begins with a single, terrifying realization. You owe no one an explanation for protecting your energy. You don't need to justify why you didn't respond to that text immediately. You don't need to apologize for choosing solitude over social obligation. You don't need to defend your decision to prioritize your own emotional well-being over someone else's comfort. The moment you stop explaining yourself, you stop giving others the power to negotiate with your boundaries. Consider the historical examples of those who changed the world through strategic withdrawal. Gandhi's power didn't come from fighting the British Empire. It came from refusing to participate in systems that exploited him. Thoreau's influence didn't emerge from engaging with society's demands. It grew from his deliberate retreat to Walden Pond. Even Jesus, according to the Gospels, regularly withdrew from crowds who wanted to use his healing abilities disappearing into solitude to reconnect with his deeper purpose. These individuals understood something that Jung articulated perfectly. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. When you become unavailable, you force everyone around you to confront what they've been avoiding in themselves. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects their own internal chaos, their own unresolved needs, their own desperate attempts to avoid facing their inner world. The counterintuitive truth is that unavailability doesn't make you less powerful. It reveals the power you've always possessed but have been giving away. When you stop being predictable, you become mysterious. When you stop being accessible, you become valuable. When you stop responding to every emotional emergency, people stop treating you like an emotional paramedic and start treating you like a human being. But here's the radical shift in perspective that changes everything. You must learn to see your energy as sacred, not in some mystical sense, but in a deeply practical way. Your attention, your emotional labor, your time, your peace of mind, these aren't renewable resources that you can spend carelessly. They're finite gifts that you have the right, even the responsibility, to protect. The practice begins with small acts of conscious unavailability. Don't respond to texts immediately, let them sit. Don't fill every silence in conversations, let others experience the discomfort of their own thoughts. Don't offer solutions to problems you didn't create, let people struggle with their own growth. Don't explain your choices to people who weren't involved in making them. Let your actions speak for themselves. Watch what happens when you implement these practices. Notice who gets uncomfortable when you stop being instantly responsive. Observe who tries to guilt you back into your old patterns. Pay attention to who accuses you of changing when you simply start honoring your own needs. These reactions will tell you everything you need to know about the true nature of your relationships. The most liberating realization is this: the people who truly love you will respect your boundaries. Those who don't weren't loving you anyway, they were using you. Here's the truth that will either liberate you or terrify you, depending on how ready you are to face reality. Most people in your life don't actually know you exist. They know the version of you that serves their needs. They're familiar with the you that responds, reacts, helps, fixes, and soothes. They're comfortable with the you that absorbs their chaos and reflects back their preferred image of themselves. But the real you, the one with dreams that have nothing to do with their problems, desires that don't revolve around their comfort, thoughts that exist independent of their approval, that person is a complete stranger to them. This isn't their fault, and it isn't yours. It's the inevitable result of a psychological contract you unknowingly signed years ago. I will be what you need me to be, and in exchange, you will give me the feeling that I matter. But here's what Jung understood with devastating clarity. This contract is a form of mutual self-destruction. You destroy yourself by disappearing, and you destroy them by enabling their inability to face themselves. When you finally withdraw your availability, something profound and terrifying happens. You discover who you are when no one is watching. You encounter the parts of yourself that have been buried under years of people-pleasing, the aspects of your personality that were sacrificed on the altar of acceptance, the dreams and desires that were abandoned because they didn't serve anyone else's agenda. This is what Jung called the shadow, not the evil parts of yourself, but the authentic parts that you've disowned because they weren't socially acceptable, useful to others, or compatible with your persona as the eternally available one. Your shadow contains your capacity for selfishness, your right to be unavailable, your permission to prioritize yourself, your freedom to be misunderstood. The ultimate realization is this: your unavailability isn't cruelty. It's the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. When you stop enabling others' emotional dependency, you force them to develop their own emotional resources. When you stop being their solution, you give them the opportunity to discover their own strength. When you stop being available for their projections, you create space for authentic relationship to emerge. But here's the part that will shake you to your core. Most people will not choose authentic relationship. They will choose to find another source of emotional supply rather than do the work of becoming whole within themselves. This isn't a judgment. It's simply a recognition of where most people are in their psychological development. They're not ready for the complexity, the unpredictability, the mutual respect that real relationship requires. And this brings us to the most profound truth of all. Your willingness to be disliked, misunderstood, and even abandoned for the sake of your authentic self is the foundation of all genuine love. Not the needy, desperate, conditional love that depends on performance and availability, but the rare, precious love that sees you fully and chooses you anyway. When you stop being available to everyone, you become available to yourself for the first time. In that availability to yourself, you discover something revolutionary. You are enough, not because of what you do for others, not because of how useful you are, not because of how well you meet everyone's needs, but simply because you exist. Your existence is not a problem to be solved through service to others. It's a gift to be honored through service to yourself. The silence that comes when you withdraw your availability isn't empty, it's pregnant with possibility. In that silence, you can finally hear your own voice, your own desires, your own truth. You can finally ask the questions that matter. What do I want? What brings me joy? What would I do if I didn't have to consider anyone else's opinion? Who am I when I'm not performing? The people who can't tolerate your unavailability reveal themselves as those who never loved you, they loved your function. But here's the beautiful paradox. When you're no longer available to those who don't truly see you, you become incredibly available to those who do. When you stop scattering your energy in all directions, you can focus it on the relationships, the work, the dreams that actually nourish your soul. This is the path of individuation, not becoming someone else, but becoming who you've always been underneath the performance. It's the journey from being everyone's answer to being your own question, from being their solution to being your own mystery, from being their resource to being your own sanctuary. The world will not celebrate this transformation. Society profits from your availability, your compliance, your willingness to put everyone else first. But your soul, your deep, authentic, irreplaceable soul has been waiting your entire life for you to choose yourself, to become unavailable to everything that diminishes you, and finally, completely, unapologetically available to everything that makes you whole. The question that remains is simple but terrifying. Are you ready to disappoint everyone else to finally meet yourself? Because that's what it takes. That's what it costs. And that's what it's worth. Remember this. When you stop being available, everything changes. But the most important change isn't in how others see you. It's in how you finally, after all these years, begin to see yourself.